Okay, we're back. All right, I'd now like to call our final panel, the Honorable Mata Abraham Matar, former member of Bahrain's parliament, Mr. Leslie Campbell, Senior Associate, Regional Director, Middle East and North Africa Programs, National Democratic Institute, Tom Milanowski, Washington Director of Human Rights Watch, Mr. Richard Solom, Deputy Director, Physicians for Human Rights. Welcome, everybody, and we will begin with the Honorable Matar, Abraham Matar. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. You may begin your testimony, and we welcome you here. And I apologize to everybody for the delay, but there are some things that we can control. There are some things we can't control. Votes we can't control. So anyway, thank you. I think you make sure your green light is on there.
Good afternoon. It is my pleasure today to participate in this hearing. I would like to thank the Congress and the Senate for their recognition to the struggle in Bahrain and holding this event today. I hope we can reach tangible outcome from this event. I would like to thank Senator Wyden and McGovern and all the representatives and senates who show the commitment for the case of Bahrain. Being here in the Capitol Hill and talking about the situation in Bahrain, this reminded me with Nabil Rajab and Abdel Jalil Singais. They were here in 2008 giving a congressional briefing about the situation in Bahrain. Both of them currently in a prison for their opinion. Before going and talking, or let me first give some quick comments about what I heard today. A lot of advices for both sides to sit and to start a dialogue. I'm here to announce that the opposition is ready for the dialogue. I'm here to announce we are inviting the Crown Prince to come to Al Wifaq to start the discussion. If he is refusing our invitation, we are ready to accept his invitation. Since 13 March, we did not get any invitation for talk from the government, just talk. We were ready to sit with the most extremist hardliner in the ruling family. He is Khalid bin Ahmed. And of course, we don't mind to sit with the moderates, such as the Crown Prince or anyone else. So if they are not going to invite us, we are inviting them. So this is regarding to sit together. And there were a talk about the violence and bombs and Molotov cocktail and so on, such issues. Our statements regarding violence was consistent and continuous. We always repeat that we are against the violence. And there is a lot of exaggeration about the violence in Bahrain, because if you come to the indicators, I have very simple question. How many policemen had been killed because of the violence? How many protesters are accused for having weapons, having guns? How many policemen was targeted with live ammunition or kidnapped? Or how many attempt to assassinations for any officials? It is zero. So talking about violence is with a lot of exaggeration. Talking about bombs in Bahrain, how many explosions happen in Bahrain? So there is cocktail Molotov, and our policy and our statement is very clear about it. Regarding the assessment of the situation by U.S. government, I would like to bring some notes here. The gap is very huge between the assessment of U.S. government and the assessment of the international community and the neutral observers. When it comes to the political rights, we'll see lack of statements coming from U.S. government about the political rights, the right of people to govern, to have elected government, for example. We will see lack of a statement about the assessment of the judiciary system in Bahrain. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Human Rights Face, Office of High Commission of Human Rights, they give very clear assessment about the situation of judicial system in Bahrain. They are saying it is unfair. They are saying it is type of political persecution against the pro-democracy movement. Such a statement and such assessment is not there by U.S. government. So let me now start by giving the big picture before talking about the details of implementing BICI report. Based on the Economist Intelligence Unit Democracy Index, it is a democracy index by Economist Intelligence Unit. It is considering Bahrain as authoritarian regime. Bahrain is, such conclusion had been also mentioned in BICI report at point 50. The Article 50 in BICI report is saying that the king enjoy a broad executive power. The king enjoys broad executive power. And in this index of democracy, Bahrain is considered as absolute monarchy, while the king always is saying that Bahrain is a constitutional monarchy, not absolute monarchy. So there is a denial that there is a struggle and there is absence of democracy in Bahrain. And with this denial, a few options remains with the regime. If you are denying the problems, you don't have an option except just to ignore all the ongoing violation and the problems and to find excuses for them instead of finding them. Such image such a big picture can give us an explanation whether the government can proceed and move forward in implementing BICI report. Regarding the implementation of BICI report, the statements that are coming from U.S. government that it is not complete, I don't feel this is an accurate assessment. The assessment that came from all the international observers that the implementation of BICR is disappointing. It is not incomplete, it is disappointing. And the gap is very huge. There is a huge gaps regarding the accountability, regarding retaining those who are dismissed from their works and retaining them in different positions and canceling their promotion. By the way, still the government is suspending some teachers and some employer and the medics for fake accusation to participate in the demonstrations. Returning to index of democracy, Bahrain is considered worse than Cuba and worse than China. It is worse than Qatar and Oman, who don't have an elected parliament. Bahrain and this index fell 22 steps, and it is now considered as one of the 25 worst country around the world. It is part of the worst 25 country around the world. And it failed the maximum, the steps that the Bahrain failed in this ranking was the maximum. No country failed in this ranking by 22 steps. If you look at the situation in Bahrain, it was not difficult for any observer to expect all this violation that is going to happen. It is not difficult for any observer to see the deterioration of the situation in Bahrain. When I met Hillary Clinton, Madam Hillary Clinton, when she was in Bahrain before the uprising, I raised this question for her about the 25 activists who were arrested and tortured. And I told her, is there certain limit that you will accept for the violation for human rights and your friends and your strategic ally in Bahrain? The answer from her, part of her answer, she was saying that I shouldn't look just from the empty side of the glass. I should look for the full side of the glass. She were talking about Bahrain as one of the leading country in the region. But as you see, the situation is totally different in Bahrain. And the recent speech of Madam Hillary Clinton in the museum, in the Holocaust Museum, she was talking about prevention and response strategy against the campaigns of harassment and violence against a group of people because of their ethnic and racial and religious and political background. She was talking about the moral obligations. I don't know, does such deterioration in Bahrain trigger anything here in US to think about and to review the policy and to review the relation with this regime? I'm here in this hearing, I'm not asking for help. I'm not asking US government to fight for democracy and freedom instead of the Bahrainis. I'm here to talk about considering Bahrain as strategic ally, as US non-NATO ally, and the obligation on US government for running one of the major basement, the Fifth Fleet, running it with the support of such regime. Does it need a lot of research for the conclusion to be reached by the expert in national security and military that such relation with such a regime is not sustainable? How long this regime can continue on this policy? How long we will not see a change and reform in the region? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? The change is coming. And having the relation with such regime and giving the support for such regime is totally wrong strategy. It is very hard for me to admit that Bahrain is a weak country in terms of many perspectives. Bahrain is weak comparing with the Gulf country in terms of economy, in terms of complicated demography, in terms of being between giant countries such as Iran and Iraq. It is very bad feeling to see Bahrain is used because it is weak. It is very bad feeling to see all solutions in Bahrain are suspended, waiting the struggle with Iran and the change in Syria is happening. I think this struggle will take a long time. Waiting the change there to have an active and proactive policy in Bahrain is, I don't feel it is the right decision and the right policy. So returning to the situation about implementing BICI report, the struggle is very clear if we focus, for example, about the number of people who were killed after BICI report. The number of people who were killed after BICR report are 35%. And before BICR report, they are 45. So the death rate in Bahrain is almost the same. The number of people who are injured because of excessive force is increasing in the last 2 months. The number of houses which are raided, the torture and secret detention center is going on in Bahrain, and that's why the Bahrain regime refused to give the acceptance for the special rapporteur of torture to get in Bahrain before about 6 months ago, and they just delay his plan. So situation in Bahrain is need a strong stand from the Congress and from U.S. government. I'm here to urge the Congress to have a constructive role in this struggle, and here are some steps that need to be supported by the Congress. In any country that have such a problem and struggle, it is the easiest solution is to go for national unity government, which have members from both sides, opposition and the loyalists, and there should be a prime minister who is agreed on. We urge the Congress to push for this idea, and the government will be responsible about implementing BICI report and to moving forward to address the problem of reconciliation and the promoting the dialogue. Also, it is very important to solve the issue of accountability in Bahrain by having a special national court with international expertise and monitoring to look at all the violations that happen by all sides. A serious action that can be taken is the police reform, and there are very successful stories in South Africa and North Ireland. We should look at them and we should implement them. We don't want to see autonomy as a stuff in Bahrain. We want to see the US government playing a role as having a partnership in this and having much stronger role there. So finally, I just recommend to stop all security and military engagement with Bahrain if all this, if they are not responding in a genuine way with all these issues. Thanks again, and it is my pleasure and honor to participate here today.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. Campbell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks again, or thank you for the opportunity to comment on human rights and political reform in Bahrain. I was not going to start with an anecdote, but now listening to some of the other presentations, I think I will. It's a very heavy sort of day with very serious topic, obviously, but listening to this reminded me of my first trip to Bahrain, which was 2002. And back then, NDI, National Democratic Institute, we were actually very welcome. It was in the middle of the government, the king, being very much interested in moving political reform forward. They were looking for help and advice from the outside, and in fact were very open to organizations coming in and working with parliamentarians and on elections and so on. And in a meeting with the king, and those of you who have met with him, I'm sure you have, you know that he's got a good sense of humor, he's open, he's very easy to talk to. Near the end of the meeting, he said, I'm a little bit afraid that, with your organization, you're like a human rights organization, you're going to think that everything has to happen quickly and overnight. And he said, we're going to have reform in Bahrain, but it's going to be, slow, and it's going to be sort of steady. And I said, Your Majesty, I agree with you that reform in Bahrain should be slow and steady, but I suspect that when I say slow and steady, I'm thinking in my head 5 years. I suspect you're thinking not in my lifetime, and probably not in your lifetime. And he actually laughed about that at the time, and he joked and he said, well, I'm not saying not my lifetime, but he said we probably have a different sense of what slow and steady might be. It turns out that was certainly the case, and I mentioned 2002. And I'm going to talk about political reform today. NDI is not a human rights organization per se. We worked with people like the Honorable Gentleman beside me and others in Bahrain on political reform as well as with the government. But I mentioned 2002 because the issues that we worked actually at the time very successfully and very collaboratively with the Bahrainis on in 2002 are unfortunately the same issues that are in play today. And I want to quote from a focus group report. And the report was, the focus groups were done by NDI in 2002. The report was authored by Tom Milia, who was then a vice president of NDI, but he's gone on to become Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor. He's a colleague of Assistant Secretary Posner. And I'll quote from Mr. Milia's report in 2002. He says, no one objects to the monarchy per se. This is based on focus groups with Bahrainis. And no one questions the Sheikh's elevation to king last year, but Bahrainis have a widely shared sense that the government of Bahrain is not the people's government at all, but rather acts in the interests of the royal family and a small circle around it. And I think the same thing could probably be said today, that for what I will call the moderate political opposition, it's not so much objecting to the king, the royal family, or the idea of a constitutional monarchy in the true sense of that word. It's that there are systematic and structural problems that don't allow Bahrain to be ruled that way. And in the interest of time, I will cut right to the chase and say that in 1999, when the king came to power, in 2002, when elections were first held in Bahrain in this modern era, and right up to now, the political issues remain exactly the same. There should be elections that are based on relatively equal districts. Just to give you an example of why they're not equal right now, the United Nations Development Program has said, and I quote them in a report from their Program on Governance in the Arab Region, that the electoral districts in Bahrain have resulted in charges of gerrymandering. The largest districts, which are mainly Shiite, contain over 12,000 people, while the smallest, which are predominantly Sunni, have only 500 voters. So the first issue that I would put forward, and it's not new to me, it's been mentioned many times, is that you have, I think gerrymandering is much too gentle a word for it. You have this incredibly disproportionate districts that means that even if votes are cast freely, the results will never reflect even remotely the population of the country or their wishes. So districts have to be redrawn. I understand that they will never be equal, probably can't be equal, but there's some kind of formula that can be adopted to make them relatively equal. Secondly, the government should be formed on the basis of election results, and this has been discussed in Bahrain for more than 10 years. The party, or in Bahrain they're called political societies, the political forces that are able in a free election to win the majority of seats. The king, in his role as the monarch in a true constitutional monarchy, should ask that party to form a government. They may do it in coalition, they may do it in the way as Mater Mater has said, they may do a national unity government, but they should be asked to form that government. A parliament, which then has true power, including the ability to withdraw or to give confidence in that government, should be able to govern. The other large sticking point for the political opposition that has gone back right to 2002 is that there is an upper house, and that upper house, which is appointed by the king, has equal power to the lower chamber. There is nothing inherently wrong with having an upper house or an appointed upper house. I would not argue one way or the other. I'm actually from Canada originally. We have an appointed upper house. That in and of itself is not wrong. But an appointed upper house, to my knowledge, in a democratic country, can't have equal power to the elected chamber and be able to stop any of the initiatives put forward by the elected chamber. I would make those 3 points, which again, have been made for 10 or 12 years in Bahrain, and you could take that as just the, kind of the ramblings or the sort of ideals of another NGO representative here that's looking for an ideal situation. But in fact, those exact same principles, which I think most of the organizations that work in democratic development would promote for Bahrain, have been mentioned by the Crown Prince himself. And when he put forward 7 principles back in March of 2011, his 7 principles, number 1, included a fully representative parliament with exclusive legislative authority. This is what the Crown Prince Salman said. An elected and representative cabinet, equitable electoral districts. He mentioned other good things as well. In response, somewhat later, the opposition parties, again, what I would call the moderate opposition parties, issued something that became known as the Manama document, and it put forward 5 demands. Number 1, an elected parliament. Number 2, fair electoral districts. Number 3, a unicameral parliament with the legislature having sole power over legislation. They also talked about the judicial system and army and so on. The lists are strikingly similar, and in fact, the Crown Prince's principles probably went further than the demands of the opposition. So what I would argue, and I'm compressing this obviously, and I've submitted written testimony that's a little bit longer, a little more detailed, but to compress this, I would argue that if democracy organizations, NGOs that have worked on these issues for 30 or 40 years, looking at the experiences of other countries, can put forward a series of recommendations, and I would say that I would make 3. The evolution into a true constitutional monarchy by allowing a free election with relatively equal districts, and the ruling family, the king asking the group or the groups that win that election to form a government, but the ruling family maintaining their privilege and their prestige, as happens in most constitutional monarchies. Parties that compete in these elections with rules and strict party finance regulations, which kind of address the issue of foreign interference. I think obviously the Bahrainis have a right to stop any kind of foreign interference. An independent election commission that administers the elections transparently. I would make all those recommendations as a person from a democracy organization. They're almost exactly in line with both the Crown Prince Salman's principles and with the Manama Declaration. And I would conclude, Mr. Chairman, by reflecting your point earlier, that if there's so much concurrence, something has to happen to bring these groups together on these points. An international mediator conciliation, I think, is a worthwhile thing to look into. It's been resisted, it's been suggested in Bahrain, but I would argue, and quite strongly argue, that there are moderates within the opposition. Certainly there are moderates within the ruling family and the government The points that they have put forward in terms of political reform are very, very similar. If the political reform went forward, I would then say that the human rights concerns, which are grave and extremely important, can then be addressed in a way that would be much more permanent. What I fear is that the human rights concerns, if they're addressed now, are simply a Band-Aid, and that this deep, deep-seated political problem will erupt again almost inevitably. And I'll just conclude by saying that, why would I think that? Because the same issues that were discussed in 2002 are being discussed in 2012. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Malinowski, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Congressman Burton, Ms. Woolsey. Thank you so much for holding this hearing. And I want to thank you in particular for how energetically and consistently you've focused on this small but very, very important country. It really needs that kind of focus in the months ahead. I want to do three things. One, just give you my answer to the question of how they are doing in implementing the recommendations of the Bassiouni Commission report. Make a couple of suggestions about what the United States can do to try to shore up moderates in Bahrain while isolating those who oppose reform, and say a few words, I think particularly addressing the issues that Mr. Burton raised about America's strategic interests in Bahrain and the Persian Gulf, and why I think that promoting reform there is a strategic as well as a moral imperative. In terms of the BICI, look, I think we all agree that it was a golden opportunity, and we all agree that the King of Bahrain deserves enormous credit for having commissioned the report and accepting its very difficult and painful recommendations. And there was some genuine progress in the wake of that report in addressing the concerns that it raised, and I go into some of that progress in my testimony. Absolutely undeniable. But I think it's also undeniable that in the last few months, the momentum that followed the release of the report has dissipated. One of the key recommendations, as we have discussed, of the report was that the government drop charges against people who had been convicted, imprisoned, detained solely for so-called speech offenses, what they said, what they wrote, demonstrations they participated in. And some of those people were released. But many opposition leaders who were convicted, often to life in prison, for precisely those kinds of offenses are still in prison. The case of Nabil Rajab has been discussed. This is why that case is important. It's not because some of us may like him, some do, some don't. That's irrelevant. The issue is that he was convicted. His case is not pending. He was convicted and sentenced to 3 months in prison for a tweet. You can't say that you are dropping charges against people for free expression if you are charging and convicting them for free expression. So it goes to the heart of what the Bassiouni Commission was recommending. You mentioned accountability. There have been some investigations, which is good, but the only people to our knowledge who have been held accountable so far are lower-ranking police officers. No one in a position of real responsibility has been held accountable for what the Bassiouni Commission called systematic torture in the suppression of dissent in that country. Abuse of prisoners in police stations has declined considerably. That's one element of progress. But we still have this use of force by riot police, not just against kids who are throwing Molotov cocktails, which, one can understand police in that situation reacting strongly, but against unarmed members of the opposition, using birdshot, firing tear gas, directly at somebody's face from very close range. Things that are clearly inappropriate and that cause serious, serious harm. And on top of this all, there has not been dialogue. And I don't think it's correct to suggest that this is because the government has made offers and the opposition has refused. The government, since the very early days, early last year, there has been no offer to the opposition to sit down one-on-one, to have a serious conversation about the kind of reasonable solution that my friend Les Campbell just outlined, that I think everybody believes is achievable if leaders on both sides were to come together. And this is partly because the Crown Prince, who is the main champion of reform within the Bahraini government, has been marginalized within the government. They send him to Washington, but within Bahrain, he has been marginalized. And the effect of all of this, and I think Congressman Woolsey mentioned this, is that both sides are becoming frustrated and angry and increasingly radicalized, and that's dangerous. And I want to mention this is a problem on the Sunni side. If you look at the pro-government press in Bahrain, and it's, apart from one newspaper, it's all pro-government, state-controlled, there is relentless propaganda suggesting that all of these protests are just inspired by Iran, that they're designed not to promote democracy, but to impose some sort of Shiite theocracy, and urging the king not to reform. And a lot of this messaging on the pro-government side has taken on a very viciously anti-American character. There is one newspaper called Al-Watan, which I want to mention, where every week you've got editorials accusing, believe it or not, the United States government of being in league with the mullahs of Iran and Al-Qaeda at the same time to support the democracy protests in Bahrain. Now, you might think this is a fringe publication, but it's actually bankrolled by the defense minister's brother, and the defense minister recently praised the editor for his service to the nation. I just wanted to note the irony that this is the same defense minister who eagerly accepts our military assistance. Very complicated on the Sunni side, and very dangerous increasingly. And then, of course, on the opposition side, you see the youth on the streets. You see the use of Molotov cocktails, violence against police, which is extremely disturbing. We have all rightly called on leaders of the opposition to condemn that violence, and I think they have consistently. But their voices are increasingly not heeded by these young boys on the street, who are impatient, who think dialogue isn't getting us anywhere. And of course, that's incredibly dangerous. Now, what can we do in all of this? I think there's no question that the administration has made considerable efforts. In fact, oddly, I think they've done a lot more than Mike Posner mentioned that they've done to try to broker a compromise between the two sides, to try to keep the opposition legal, to try to convince them to restrain riot police from acting excessively. But they don't get a lot of credit for what they've done because they don't talk about it a lot. And so people in Bahrain, especially in the opposition side, don't hear it. And then there's the arms sale and the relationship with the military. Now, I can understand why the administration made that choice. The Crown Prince had come to Washington. He is the champion of the reform in the Bahraini government. They wanted to give him something to take home, to say he could, that he had delivered something from the United States in order to preserve his relevance in the system so that he isn't further eclipsed by the hardliners in the government. I get that. But the question it raises is, if we're going to take those kinds of steps to shore up the moderates in the government, what are we willing to do to shore up the moderates in the opposition, who are also in danger of being eclipsed by more radical voices? So here I have a suggestion. I think you and I, Mr. Chairman, at least, agree that it would help if we suspended military sales to the Bahrain Defense Forces. Realistically, I'm not sure if that's going to happen because of the stake that the Defense Department has on the island. An alternative approach, one that we've tried with other countries, would be to impose, not to sanction the government of Bahrain, but to impose very highly targeted sanctions like a visa ban against those individuals within it who have been credibly linked, including by the Bassiouni Commission, to the worst crimes, including the torture of dissidents. Remember, the Bassiouni Commission identified a lot of these people. They turned over the evidence to the Bahraini government, which has not acted on it. And I think so long as the government does not act, it's perfectly reasonable for the U.S. government to say that we won't allow those persons to travel to the U.S. That would still enable us to maintain our relationship with the government and even with the military of Bahrain, while isolating only those individuals who are standing against reform and the Crown Prince's agenda in the country. And it would be consistent with what U.S. law already requires. It's just that U.S. law doesn't require us right now to proactively identify the individuals who should be subject to that kind of ban. And I think the administration can and should do that. If they don't, the Congress could require it, either by passing a version of the Magnitsky Rule of Law Act, which in the Senate right now would apply to the entire world and would actually require the administration to do something along the lines of what I've described, or even Bahrain-specific legislation that is similar to the Magnitsky bill. It's something I would urge you to consider. And as you do, I would keep in mind that, you know, although they haven't said so and might deny it, the Bahraini government has imposed effectively a visa ban on certain Americans itself. I was there once, had a very interesting experience, met with the government. I'm not sure if they'd let me back because I've since written critical things. Many representatives of human rights and democracy organizations have been denied visas. Journalists have been denied. Mr. Chairman, if you are not a member of Congress and you published somewhere what you said today, I imagine you would be denied a visa to visit Bahrain, and that's because of speech. That's because we disagree with them. All I'm suggesting is that we do the same for people who've committed very grave crimes. I think that's a reasonable request. And then finally, on the strategic interests, obviously the relationship with the Bahraini military is important to the United States. It's important to the U.S. Congress. They host the Fifth Fleet, and I get why that's something that no one in the U.S. government would want to lose. But I think we also need to be realistic about this, not idealistic, but realistic. That presence in Bahrain is not going to be sustainable if the violence, the human rights abuses reach a certain point. If it continues along this trajectory and it becomes something like Syria, we're not going to be able to stay anyway. But in the meantime, if Bahrain's rulers believe that the United States will continue to depend on them, no matter what they do, they'll be less likely to heed the kinds of concerns that we expressed here, because they'll think we need them more than they need us. And so, ironically, I think the more we make preserving the base the paramount interest in our relationship with Bahrain, the more likely we are to lose it, because they'll be more likely to take the kinds of steps that will cause a fundamental breach in the relationship between our two countries. So I think that's something to keep in mind. I'm not suggesting that you conclude that the only important issue here is human rights and the strategic relationship, set that aside. Obviously, they're both important, but they are mutually reinforcing. If there isn't progress on one front, we are going to be in major trouble on the other. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Solom?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. Mr. Chairman, in the interest of time, I'd like to summarize my remarks and ask that my full testimony be entered into the record. In addition, I'd like to submit 2 recent PHR reports on Bahrain by Physicians for Human Rights. As Deputy Director of PHR, I've traveled to Bahrain 3 times over the past 18 months to investigate human rights violations, most recently this past April. When I testified before this commission last year, I was hopeful that the Kingdom of Bahrain would begin to improve its human rights record. Instead, I find a government fixated on rhetoric rather than results. I'll focus my comments today on 3 areas of concern: the targeting of doctors, the militarization of Bahrain's health system, and excessive use of force. First, I'd like to update you on the ongoing case against the Bahraini doctors. 48 of the country's leading medical specialists were detained, tortured, and forced to sign false confessions last year. A military court convicted them of spurious charges, including attempting to overthrow the regime. Following international pressure, the Bahraini government did transfer these 48 cases from military to civilian court. The BICI devotes 10% of its 500-page report to the events at Salminia Hospital and concluded that allegations against the medics were unfounded. However, while 9 medics were acquitted last month, another 9 face up to 5 years in prison. The Court of Cassation will issue its verdict on the doctor's final appeal on October 1st. In addition to these 48 medics, I'd like to draw your attention to 3 others who currently languish in Jah prison in Manama. They are Yunus Ashuri, Hassan Al-Matuk, Ahmed Al-Mushatet. Contrary to government assertions, these 3 cases demonstrate that indeed not all cases were transferred to civilian courts, and that not all medics have been released from detention. The second and related concern is the ongoing militarization of Bahrain's largest hospital, Salaminiya Medical Complex. Over the past 18 months, the government has implemented policies and committed acts that instill widespread fear among many who seek medical treatment there. According to sick and wounded civilians whom I interviewed in April 2012, this fear is due to, 1, the ongoing presence of state security forces inside the hospital, 2, the systematic interrogation of incoming patients and visitors, and 3, the subsequent beating, detention, and prosecution of untold numbers of Shia who are suspected of having participated in demonstrations. 8 months following the BICI report, our assessment is that the government continues to violate principles of medical neutrality, harass Shia medical workers, and impede patients from receiving care. A third area of concern is the continued use of excessive force in Bahrain. For the past 500 days, Bahraini authorities have waged an unprecedented campaign against Shia civilians by weaponizing toxic chemical agents, so-called tear gas. I spoke with 16 survivors of such attacks. One young man reported that Bahraini police fired a tear gas canister directly at him, fracturing facial bones and rupturing his left eye. His medical records showed that surgeons were unsuccessful in saving his eye. He is now permanently blind. Bahraini authorities go one malicious step further and carry out raids in Shia neighborhoods, storming down doors and breaking windows for the sole purpose of terrorizing Shia families with tear gas inside their homes. Over the past year, we have documented the serious long-term harm that results from these unprovoked and flagrant attacks. Miscarriages, severe respiratory distress resulting in premature death, and genetic mutations causing deformities are some of the health consequences we predict will become more prevalent in Bahrain as a direct result of police violence. Government assertions that perpetrators of human rights abuses are being held accountable are tenuous, and allegations of torture persist. I received 3 corroborated testimonies from 3 young protesters who reported being tortured by police in makeshift detention facilities, such as at the former International Youth Hostel next to an existing police station in Manama. Of the more than 2,900 arrests made during the 10-week state of emergency last year, the BICI received 559 allegations of torture. If the government were committed to ending impunity, it would investigate all of these abuses and the 20 deaths that the BICI attributed to Bahraini security forces alone. As of last month, the government has charged approximately 15 low-ranking security officials regarding abuses against protesters. To date, I am unaware of any high-ranking official who has been held to account. This, despite the BICI conclusion that such a pattern of abuse could not have happened without the knowledge of higher echelons of security forces. Employing international advisors, conducting human rights training seminars, and establishing new codes of conduct are all well and good. But if the government truly wanted to improve their human rights record, it would stop tear gassing families inside their homes, and it would simply stop torturing. In conclusion, I propose the following actions on the part of the U.S. government. Members of Congress should support Congressman McDermott's medical neutrality bill, H.R. 2643. The administration should withhold all military assistance to Bahrain until the government makes measurable progress on human rights. And it should continue to deny export licenses for tear gas to Bahrain until the government adheres to UN guidelines on the use of force and firearms. Thank you again for inviting me here today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Well, thank you all very much.